Thanks again for inviting me, and thanks to the organizers for doing such a great job in organizing this exciting conference. This is a question that I think should interest most of us. So let's see what we can do about this. What I did, and if I switch this on, this would also work, and it does work. No. To address this question, I drew some inspiration from Jim Jenkins, who was one of the greatest memory researchers. He's not around anymore. And he once wrote a book chapter called 4 Points to Remember, a tetrahedral model of memory experiments. And he came up with something that looks like this. He pointed out that in any memory experiment, you may have four-way interactions among various factor groups. And we shouldn't go into this. I just used this as an inspiration, and so did Winifred Strange, to adapt this to second language learning and to speech learning, where we have a learner who brings with him or with her certain learner characteristics to the task. We have a setting, and the setting could be the learning environment, could be tutored or naturalistic, could be second language or foreign language, could be the condition that you have to learn a second language voluntarily or forced. It could be the methods that we're observing in second language and second language speech learning to observe learning progress, acquisition criteria, whether we're using spontaneous or elicited data, and finally the target. Whatever we know about second language acquisition may differ from whether we're looking at the sound system, at the lexis, the vocabulary, syntax and morphology, and so on and so forth. With respect to speech learning, we may look at consonants or in vowels. We may look at phonotactics, at prosody, as we did in this morning. And the methods that we obtain could be spontaneous data, could be lab data, could be articulatory, acoustic, or perceptual analysis that we perform. I will not talk so much about these three variable collections of variables that we may observe. I will focus first of all on the learner. That's the first lecture topic, which learner characteristics affect the degree of foreign accent. And secondly, I will focus on how to predict problems with the learning target, and I will spend most time on that one, because that is it's a troubling question for all of us who work in second language acquisition, second language speech learning. So, what causes foreign accented speech? Learner characteristics which have been hypothesized to affect degree and characteristics of foreign accent are listed here, and some of you may recognize them. I could ask you which learner characteristics do you think may affect second language learning success? And one of them is certainly language and native language background. I talked this morning to a lady who speaks Arabic, Korean, and English, and also several other languages, and I admire that very much, because these are really different languages. I just speak dialects. I speak Danish, English, Frisian, and German. These are just dialects of each other. That's really no big deal. So language background may really make a difference when you learn a foreign language. Second language experience is an important factor. The length of residence, years of second language use, the type of second language input. Gender and or sex have been hypothesized to influence second language learning success. The attitude towards the second language or the second language community. Age of learning, as we also saw yesterday, age of first exposure to the second language. Motivation has been proposed as an important factor in second language learning. Language use patterns, the first language or the second language which immigrants might use. Something like language aptitude, intelligence has been suggested, and even musical ability. And there may be other factors that have been suggested to influence second language success, and these are all somehow connected with the learner, him or herself. Now, these are not truly causes of foreign accent, but rather factors which shape the characteristics. This is first language background, or may shape its degree. These are all the other factors that are listed here. So what I will do here, I will first talk about some of the learner characteristics. I can't go into all of these. And then I will talk about the first language background factor, how we assess first and second language differences between the first and the second language. But before we review this factor, I certainly don't need to mention this to you, but just to make it perfectly clear that research on foreign accent has shown that difficulty in producing language sounds is based on how we perceive sounds. not on some kind of problems with our articulatory organs, not on anatomy, maybe sometimes on the physiology, because certain sounds are also difficult to produce in first language learning, like r, for example, is late acquired. But otherwise, anatomy is not a reason. And this is probably something that you have heard, as this is a little excerpt from Soul Times a few years ago, and here you see a mother and a child. And I quote from Soul Times, which had the title was Cut Tongue for English. A scene from a movie, If You Were Me, shows that a small child gets ready to undergo a surgery in a Seoul clinic for cutting underneath part of his tongue to make it longer for better pronunciation of English. The surgery, called phrenectomy, a minor surgery which lengthens the tongue by about 1 millimeter, is gaining its popularity among South Koreans. If I had a say in South Korea, I would say jail the doctors who do this. It is absolutely criminal, and it's absolutely bad that this happens. These are overambitious parents, and the ability to produce R or L, and this is the point, has absolutely nothing to do with your tongue. And your tongue is not different from my tongue. Well, it's different. I hope it's different, but it's in a sense it's not different. Okay. So therefore, when we talk about these factors, they will be discussed with reference to both non-native speech production and perception, first language background, age of learning, and so on. Right. So let's briefly look at the factor L1 background. What I have here is for a fairly old study that I once did with native speakers of German, native speakers of Danish, and native speakers of American English. This is about the identification of German vowels, and I'm very proud to say, as a German, that the Germans did very well on these German vowels. As you can see, they are totally at ceiling. 99.9% correct was the worst that they did. And then you can see native speakers of Danish and native speakers of American English, and you can see that they differ. They also have different problems with certain vowels of German. There are only 3 vowels that are difficult for Danes, for reasons that I can't go into. Probably has something to do with their strange training that they received. And when you look at the native speakers of American English, you can see that, front rounded vowels. The front rounded vowels, ü and ü and ü and are particularly problematic for native speakers of American English. And we know why, because, well, English is one of the few Germanic languages that doesn't like front-rounded vowels. Gave it up about 1,000 years ago. Okay? Here's another example from a study, fairly frequently quoted study that I did with Jim Flaggy and a Korean colleague, where we looked at the production and also the perception of English, the English vowels I, and A, by native speakers of Mandarin, German, Korean, and Spanish, and they differed in length of residence, that is, English language experience. And what you see here, first of all, is how well these 8 learner groups, divided by experience, so 4 language groups, did with respect to the I contrast for English. And you can see that Germans did fairly well. Native speakers of Spanish did not so well. Native speakers of Mandarin, a major difference between inexperienced and experienced learners. And native speakers of Korean, I won't say anything, I don't want to say. I'm sorry. Okay. Here is something, I hope you can see that a little bit. I'm very proud of this. The Germans who arrived, as I mentioned also yesterday in the lecture, when they arrived, they were not able to produce a difference between epsilon and ash. The experienced learners did that. The Spaniards, or native speakers of Spanish, they produced some kind of overshoot. They differentiated more than native speakers. Native speakers of Mandarin, irrespective of language experience, did fairly well. And there is some effect of language experience, English language experience, for the native speakers of Korean. The more experienced learners did somewhat better than the inexperienced learners. So the problems that people have with a second language are based on their native language. That is very clear from this study and also from other studies. So these and many, many other studies of second language speech have shown, and this is a very solid fact, that non-native speakers' native language exerts a very strong influence on the production and perception of second language speech. But this strong influence is not the only source of native, non-native differences. I can show you here, also from a fairly old study, the identification of a beat-to-bit continuum, where we used 11 spectral steps between I and I, and we manipulated this in 3 durations, long, medium, and short, 150, 200, and 250 milliseconds for the vowel. And these are native speakers of English, and it shows very clearly that native speakers of English couldn't care less about duration. The three curves are right on top of each other. For them, the distinction between beat and bit is a quality distinction. Duration plays no role whatsoever. When you see this, I don't know whether you can see this. When you see this, you might say, this is only duration. These people are only interested in duration. And maybe, just maybe, these could be native speakers of Korean, because you have a duration contrast for E, long E, short E. But they're not Korean. They're native speakers of Spanish. And I don't know whether you know anything about Spanish, but Spanish has just 5 vowels, and Spanish has no duration contrast. So where does that come from? Why would they want to use duration when they don't use duration in their native language and when it's irrelevant for English? There's a little cliffhanger. I'll talk about that later. Okay, but that's something that we, first of all, couldn't make any sense of. There are further examples, and I will further examples and discussion of the two types of biases in our two-speech I will present when we talk about native language biases and universal biases in, that are first language background independent. Right. So research on other factors, like age of learning, what the learner brings to the task of language learning, language use patterns, second language experience, and so forth, is often conducted in correlational studies in which first collect information on the independent variables through a background questionnaire. It could look something like this. This is something that we have used where we ask for all kind of information by bio background, age, gender, and so on and so forth. And we also ask about language use patterns, especially language use patterns. And once we have this, we may come up with a principal components analysis, which tells us which factors could really be involved. As you can see here, when we ask about age of arrival in the United States, estimated age of speaking English comfortably, you can see this is roughly the same thing. We're asking about the same thing, so you might call it age of L2 learning. Then we have a question, these are native speakers of Korean. We want to know how important, what's the judged importance of correct Korean pronunciation? And we also ask for judged importance of correct Korean grammar. And we call that judged importance of Korean in general. So you can derive these factors because we're basically asking the same questions. This is what you like to do in questionnaires to make them more valid in a sense. Okay? So the strength of the relation of these factors to degree of foreign accent is then assessed in regression analysis, multiple regression analysis. And this is one of the first results that I want to present you, and you will not be surprised. The most important factor, what really accounts for a lot of variation in the data, is age of learning. Okay? And we know that already, right? And I think I can skip these slides because I showed them to you already yesterday. Right? This is what you saw yesterday, very clear correlation, negative correlation between age of arrival in Canada, in this case these are Italian learners, and the ability to avoid foreign accented speech. Right? Okay, so what does this mean? What does this strong negative correlation mean? It means, first of all, that there is no that there is no critical period for second language speech learning. There is no abrupt decline in the ability to avoid a foreign accent, and this decline starts in early childhood and continues way beyond puberty. There are studies which have shown that this continues into the 4th decade of life. A slight foreign accent is already detectable for early learners, roughly at 4 years of age. It's detectable, but it's not very strong. Okay? And what the age factor stands for, well, there was the plenary lecture. It's not the state of neurological development, it's the state of the development of the phonetic systems that we have in our minds. It could also be due to a difference in second language experience. The quality of second language input could also account for the strong influence of the age factor. And I'll say something about in just a second. It is certainly has nothing to do with motivation. There are no really good studies of naturalistic second language learning that indicate that motivation makes a difference. It really doesn't. Teachers don't like to hear that. In the second language classroom, this may be very different. But for naturalistic language acquisition, motivation, many studies have shown that motivation really doesn't make a difference. Okay, so is age of arrival related to difference in L2 experience? This is from a study that Jim Flegge conducted with 240 native speakers of Korean learning English as a second language. And what you can see here in this graph is the ratio of English to Korean use. Younger learners use English twice as much as Korean as older learners do, whereas older learners, as of the age of roughly 12, 13, use Korean and English equally, frequently. So this could very well account for at least part of the age effect. Okay, you've seen that before. What about language use patterns, second language experience, motivation, gender and or sex? Let's take females and males separately, and what we find is the next important factor is language used socially for females, language used at work, and that is the language use factor. Then the next most important factor is language used at home or language used socially for males. Again, language use is important. Is it Korean or English? Is it Italian or English? Then comes overall language use, whether you use language very much in your job, for example. And for males, it's length of residence. And now we're down to less than 5% of the variance. Then we have length of residence. And I'll say something about that because this is actually interesting. And language is used at home. And there comes something that has something to do with motivation. Native language loyalty, instrumental motivation. Okay? So what you see here is when we try to account for all the variation that we find in our data, motivational variables, in this case, account for maximum 2% of the variation. Okay. So what we can conclude is, for at least for people in the speech sciences and second language speech, males and females don't differ in any interesting way. The curve that you saw before for age of arrival by degree of foreign accent, this is now shown only for the females, and here you see it for the males. The difference is significant because it has a lot of statistical power, but if we look at it, not everything that is statistically significant is really worth writing home about, as you can see. Basically, the curve is a little bit steeper for females, meaning that girls are better than boys and men are better than women, but yet, does it make really a difference? It doesn't really make a difference. And you can speculate why that should be the case. Nobody really knows for this particular study, but you will agree there is no major difference between women and men or girls and boys that is really worth talking about. What we also saw is that the influence of motivational variables is negligible. As I said in studies of naturalistic immersion, and this may not be true about classroom learning. And as an interesting footnote about these studies, we can see that length of residence, even after 15 years of having lived in Canada in this case, makes a little bit of a difference. So learning is not completely over after 15 years, and this is good news for me because I've lived in Denmark for 20 years, and I still have to learn it. So learning is never really over. It reaches an asymptote, but it just doesn't stop. Okay? Additional years do indeed make a slight difference. Okay, now that we have seen that age of learning and language use patterns are the most important factors affecting degree of foreign accent, what about the remaining 20%? There are 20% that are simply unaccounted for. Okay, how do we quantify it to experience, and what does indeed cause foreign accent? And the very straightforward, the easy, straightforward, and correct answer is we simply don't know about these remaining 20%. We could say that may have something to do with talent, but what is really talent? Is it musical ability? There is really no clear evidence on this. There is some evidence that musical ability may help in the acquisition of tone languages and tones, but the studies that I've looked at don't really tell us that musical ability is related to segmental acquisition. And musical ability, mathematical ability, and general intelligence are highly correlated. So may not be musical ability that we're really measuring there. Does it have anything to do with mimicry ability? Yeah, several studies report some weak but significant effect on this. So what else? Okay, many studies have looked at length of residence as an index of second language experience. And that is dangerous, and I will show you in a second why. because length of residence, or LOR as it is frequently abbreviated, may say nothing about the quality and the amount of input. 10 years in a foreign country may lead to very different second language experiences. It must be qualified by language use patterns. And this example that I have here is also from the Schwen Bohn and Young study. What you see here is the groups, the German, Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean speakers. They were experienced and inexperienced with English, and they had resided, the experienced speakers, as you can see, the German experienced speakers for 7.5 years, and the Korean speakers for 7.3 years. So you might say, well, length of residence is equivalent. Well, it's unfair. It's deeply unfair, because when you look at the use of English, we find that the native speakers of German used English 87% of the time, and the Korean speakers 60% of the time. Okay, so length of residence is a very crude measure and needs to be qualified by language use patterns, where they were not equivalent in this particular study. So, very brief summary so far regarding research on factors other than first language background. Here you see learner characteristics that have been hypothesized to affect degree and characteristic of foreign accent. And here are the ones that have been shown to strongly affect degree and characteristics of foreign accent. First language background, second language experience in terms of years of L2 use, in terms of type of L2 input, age of learning, of course, and language use patterns. And all the other ones I shaded because, well, there are no studies of naturalistic second language speech that show that these are really strongly influential with regard to second language learning success, as far as speech is concerned. And now for first language background, the first language background factors. What causes a foreign accent? That's the really hard question. The very easy, straightforward, and largely correct answer is differences between the native and the non-native sound system. Okay? And then it gets tricky and interesting. Difference at what level? Phonetic or phonological? Does it mean that large differences cause large problems, that small differences cause small problems? How do we assess difference? Can we do this through looking at features, at the articulation, at acoustics or perception? How can we do this? And this is what I will focus on for the remaining of my talk. So a basic assumption in any model of second language speech, or any researcher who engages this, is that differences between the native and the non-native sound system cause foreign accent. But at first sight, it's pretty easy to determine differences or similarity, at least for extreme cases. The hms or engs of Korean and English are phonetically and phonologically identical. That's an extreme case of similarity. Okay? And then the R's of Spanish and Danish are phonologically the same, but phonetically extremely different. In Spanish it's a r, and in Danish it's a r. Okay? Very, very phonetically different. So this is the question of how we assess difference and similarity is basic to any prediction that we wish to make about second language learning success. If we look at, I have a few quotations here from Strange, for example, if cross-language phonetic similarity is not empirically characterized independently of second language perceptual difficulties, then the concept becomes circular, no predictive power or explanatory value. And Best wrote that non-native segments tend to be perceived according to their similarities to and discrepancies from the native segmental constellations that are in closest proximity to them in the native phonological space. And Flaggy, in his farewell talk when he retired, gave a list of what is needed most in our research, and number 2 was standardized measure of perceived first, second language phonetic distance. So this is really, really needed. And when I then looked at the literature, when I became interested, I became almost depressed. Because Peter Ladefoged, everyone knows Peter Ladefoged, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Peter Ladefoged wrote, the problem of how to know when two sounds in different languages should be considered very similar shades of sounds, I do not know of any way in which such decisions can be made on theoretical grounds. Then Ladefoged said, it's not even technically possible, and so on and so forth. Flaggy, who also knows a bit about phonetics, no satisfactory method now exists for determining whether an L2 vowel will be treated as new or similar. And Dennis Klatz, who also knew a lot about phonetics, even the simplest of adjectives, such as being able to relate pairs of vowel spectra in terms of phonetic similarity, are well beyond our capabilities and understanding. This sounds all very depressing, right? Sounds like we can't do it, but we have to do it. Otherwise, we can give up. Otherwise, we should go home and not worry about second language speech because we can't come up with any predictions. If we hear, I don't know, not even technically possible, no satisfactory method, well beyond our capabilities, and I say, well, this comes from people who really know something about phonetics, not from me, okay? These people are really, really knowledgeable. It doesn't sound good. Well, we have to try, okay? So let's try, okay? I have a few suggestions here. There are suggestions that others have come up with, namely, first of all, we could compare symbols used to transcribe sounds. We could make acoustic comparisons. We could make articulatory comparisons. I won't say anything about that because that is used very rarely. And we could use something that is called perceptual assimilation or interlingual identification to find out where learning problems might come up to determine what kind of, how the similarity relations are between sounds of the first and second language. And I just opened a can of worms. I could go on for 4 or 5 hours, but you don't want that, right? No, I can't do that. Okay, so I'll make this a little bit shorter. When we compare symbols used to transcribe sounds, we have problems, and we have problems, and we have problems. What kind of symbols should we use? Phonetic symbols? Phonemic symbols? I just talked about Spanish R and Danish R. Phonologically the same, phonetically extremely different. What transcription convention should we use? If we transcribe English beat-bit in this way, or in this way, or in this way, well, we end up with different predictions. Or English bet with this, as I would consider outdated symbol, and this one, which is the correct symbol, because it's closer to Catalan vowel. Native speakers of Spanish might think, oh, this is our A vowel. Well, it's not their A vowel. It's much more open. Okay, as you can see from this diagram. E is down here. No, it should be epsilon. Students who transcribe a vowel that comes from here as E, they fail my exam. Okay. What detail should we use in phonetic transcription? In many native English accents, we find this symbol, the U symbol, which in fact is not an U, it's a fronted U, and it's moving fronter and fronter and fronter, especially in received or in Southern British English. It should be transcribed perhaps as U bar. And can we trust phonetic symbols? In German and Swedish and Southern British English, we have a vowel that, let me see whether I can play this for you. Well, I can hear it, which is probably not good enough.
Hot.
And I could ask you, or I could ask people who know Swedish, German, and English, and they have no idea what they're hearing. And the quality is the same, absolutely the same quality, but for traditional reasons, this is transcribed differently in German, Swedish on the one hand, and in Southern British English on the other. So there are problems when we use symbols. Let's look at acoustic comparisons. These are not straightforward. There are many, many, many problems, and I'll just illustrate one or two of these. First of all, there are irrelevant acoustic differences due to vocal tract size and shape differences between first and second language speakers, and this may require speaker normalization. I discussed this with one of you yesterday, and if you ask, for instance, 10 phoneticians about how do we normalize sex differences, you get 15 different answers. It's really, that is really a can of worms. And this just shows you the vowels of English as produced by native speakers, by men, by women, and by children. And of course there's some overlap because this shows only the frequencies of the first and second formant. The third formant is missing, formant dynamics is missing, duration is missing, but still, this is a mess. You would need to normalize this. Okay? Another problem is that the effect of context, phonetic context, phonotactic context, prosodic context, on acoustic realizations can't be assumed to be the same across languages. Okay, so should we record? How should we record these vowels that we are analyzing? This is from a study that I did some time ago in which I compared how strongly vowels are co-articulated in various Germanic languages. And as you can see in Southern British English, the U is in a very different place. It's much fronted in an alveolar context. Whereas in Danish, which has many more vowels, we just can't afford to do that. It's out of the question. The U has to stay in place. So some languages co-articulate a lot, other languages co-articulate much less. And this is also something that learners have expectations about when they learn a second language, expectations that are formed by their first language. So acoustic comparisons present problems because irrelevant acoustic differences due to vocal tract size and shape may require speaker normalization. Effect of context is difficult to adjust. And then we may ask the question, and that is really the most, actually, as you will see, damaging question: is acoustic comparison between first and second languages indeed a comparison between learner's native system and the target? Okay, and that is a major problem. This is a study that I conducted together with Winifred Strange and some colleagues, in which we compared acoustic similarity to perceptual similarity. And I hope you can see here that the acoustic similarity of German Ü is strongest with American English E. The acoustic similarity of German Ö, front-rounded vowels, is strongest with American English E. These are the most similar vowels in American English to these German front-rounded vowels. And if you know a little bit about American English mispronunciations of front-rounded vowels, and you will say, what the hell is that? That is total nonsense. Because it's shown in perception. Perceptual assimilation of German Ü goes to American English U. Perceptual assimilation of German Ü goes to German O. So the two methods of determining similarity, acoustic and perceptual, yield extremely different results. As you can see from this, these quotations: marked discrepancy, it's not always predictable, incongruity, and acoustic similarities alone cannot explain context-specific assimilation patterns. So acoustics is, it's a first help, but it's not good. It's simply not good enough. So what we have to do is we have to measure acoustic similarity directly. Okay? And there are two classes of approaches which I will present to you, and then we'll have to see which one of these is perhaps better or not, or maybe if there's any difference at all. The first one is a discrete labeling task, and this involves something. This is a foreign word that I have never ever encountered before I read about Talving. It's called ekphoric similarity, and Talving defines ekphoric similarity, or ekphory, as a process by which retrieval information is provided by a cue, is correlated with the information stored in episodic memory trace. And it will become clearer when I tell you how this is done. Subjects label a stimulus, they hear something, and they label this either with an open set of orthographic or IPA symbols. This has been done in a number of studies, as you can see here, also involving me. Or they can use a closed set of forced choice alternatives. So what subjects hear is a sound, a speech sound, and they have a label for this. They are matching this with an internal representation. That's what's called ekphoric similarity. Okay, and I'd like to give you one example of an assessment of ekphoric similarity. These are is a closed set of forced choice alternatives that I've used in the study that I also talked to you about yesterday. This is about the perceptual assimilation of Danish E, Ü, and U to native E and U by native Spanish and native English speakers. And the procedure here is, first of all, auditory presentation of Danish D, Du, and Du to a native Spanish speakers. Sounds like this.
D.
Okay. Okay, we heard that before. Okay, then I'll do this. My Danish should be good enough. D, Du, Du. Okay, then these stimuli are labeled by with native English D or Do, or Spanish D or Do, and then we have a rating of goodness of fit on a Likert scale, in this case from 1 to 5, and you saw this graph before. This is then the typical result. We can see how vowels of the non-native language map onto the native language, and we see that E and U are perfectly assimilated, but Ü, Danish Ü, is not perfectly assimilated for native speakers of Spanish, but very well assimilated for native speakers of English. Here's another example of the assessment of ekphoric similarity, where Schmidt used a set of orthographic labels for the perceptual assimilation of English word initial consonants to Korean consonants. And the procedure was, again, she presented English consonant E, consonant U, and consonant R syllables to native Korean listeners, and the native Korean listeners had a free choice to use Korean initial consonant symbols, and this was also rated on a Likert scale of 1 to 5. And here are the results. Okay, this is a very large table, and I think many of you may have seen this before. It's extremely interesting because it shows that, for instance, English k, English k is assimilated very nicely to one particular Korean sound, and apparently English g is split halfway between these two Korean sounds that I won't dare to pronounce. Okay? And then we have, as you would all expect, English RL is labeled as Korean L in all cases. Okay? But what Andrea Schmidt did is something really smart. She didn't just leave it with that. As you saw, she presented this in contexts of different vowels. And this shows a slightly different picture. Okay? It shows you that when we look at, this is what I showed you before, when we look at how these are assimilated in different vowel contexts, then it's not all over the place. What we see here for English g, let me see that this is correct. In an R context, it's just this one. In an E context, it is almost exclusively this one. And it's only 50-50 in an U context. So native speakers of Korean do not just assimilate this randomly, more or less randomly, through these two categories. It depends on the consonant context. The consonant context strongly affects perceptual assimilation, which can also be seen, especially for this one. And when I saw this, I found this quite interesting, because the common stereotype of Koreans is you can say L or R and they have no idea what they're hearing. That is simply not true, according to this result. Yes, L and R of American English are assimilated to L, but look at the goodness ratings. The goodness ratings are really different. You like L as an instance of Korean L, and you don't really like R as a Korean instance of Korean L. So you make a difference in goodness ratings, which strongly indicates that you hear a difference. You just label it with the same Korean consonant, but you can hear a difference. Difference ratings, this is definitely significance, 3.0 and 3.9. So goodness ratings do reveal perceptual differentiation, if, and especially if it's got done in various vowel contexts. So, how well does phoric similarity predict perceptual problems? Here's a study that I conducted with two students, presented at the last ICFIX in Glasgow, where we looked at the perceptual assimilation of English word initial fricatives and affricates to Danish consonants. And what you see here is something that could be a slightly familiar problem. English F and F are assimilated both to F in Danish. Sounds familiar to many non-native speakers. Danish does not have voiced fricatives, so English S is assimilated, English S and Z are both assimilated to Danish S. Okay? And this could indicate some problems with perception, and we looked also at the identification of these sounds by native speakers of Danish, and what you see here is English F is not very well identified as English F. This is kind of hypercorrection. They hear F and they think, well, it could perhaps be Th, and they wrongly respond Th. And Th is frequently identified as Th, but also quite frequently as Th. So it predicts the assimilation pattern, in this case, predicts perceptual problem, as it does for S and Z, where you can also see that the identification is far from perfect. It's quite good, but it's far from perfect. And this has to do with the assimilation to the same Danish consonant, which, however, just as for Korean, differs in the goodness with these sounds were assimilated. So, phoric similarity predicts perceptual and thus production problems quite well. However, not all perceptual and thus production problems are predicted by considering phoric similarity. I will say more on that later. And one important methodological problem with studies of phoric similarity is that we don't really know what listeners are doing there. Listeners hear a second language token, They identify it in terms of a mental representation of the L1 category, that's called ekphory. They rate this in terms of goodness, a fit of the imagined category. So what are they thinking about? And for many of the studies that we have conducted, we had to include speakers. We don't know for some non-native speakers what's actually going on in their heads. In the studies that I did with Winifred Strange, we had to exclude 1/3 of the participants. These were students at the Graduate University, at the Graduate Center of New York, the City University of New York. So they were pretty smart people. 1/3 of them had to be excluded. The reason for this is something that Koreans and Germans, of course, don't have, because we have reasonable orthographies. Native speakers of English have your orthography just is really, really bad, okay? So even intelligent people have problems with that, so we had to discard data from 1/3 of the participants after many training studies. So this is a general problem of the orthographic representation of speech sounds in some languages. You probably could do it with Koreans, you can do it with native speakers of German, especially Finnish, and so on and so forth, but definitely not, it's not a good idea to do this or collect data from all speakers of English or French or some other languages that have strange orthographies. So is there an alternative to ekphoric similarity? What's used in many studies? Well, there is something called perceptual similarity. And if you thought that we just did perceptual similarity, no, not according to Talving. In perceptual similarity, you compare the similarity of two auditorily presented sounds. And this is designed not to access listeners' own internal representation of phonetic categories. This would be ekphoric similarity, but designed to compare specific productions. Okay? Let's just see whether this works. Otherwise, I have to do this, and that would not be a good idea.
Did.
These are the 3 Danish vowels. And these are the 2 Southern British English vowels that we compared.
Did.
Okay, right. So they hear these vowels, and they have to, in pairs, and they have to say how similar or different these vowels are. Okay. So how does ekphoric similarity relate to perceptual similarity? And Jim Flagge once suggested that we should obtain samples of all L1 and L2 phones in many contexts produced by representative first and second language monolinguals. And you can imagine that becomes absolutely astronomical number. So what we did in one study is we asked how Southern British English front vowels map onto Danish front vowels. So how do Danish front vowels map onto Southern British English front vowels? So these are, again, Southern British English vowels. Your orthography is really lousy, but you make very good use of the vowel space. They are equally spaced, as you can see. Here is
did, that.
Okay, this is how vowels should like. This is Danish how vowels should not look like. Okay, because Danish just makes use of the upper portion of the vowel space, and these are the 4 unrounded front vowels of Danish.
Did.
And if you think that he just repeated vowels, no, these are different vowels. Trust me, I have a problem learning this. Okay, so what we did here, I'll just present one result where we looked at how this vowel, Southern British English ear, maps onto Danish, okay, in terms of both ekphoric and perceptual similarity. So in terms of ekphoric similarity, it's clear that the preferred label for this in Danish is the second highest front vowel, namely e, Danish e for English ear. When we look, however, at perceptual similarity, it looks different. It's a different vowel that is the preferred vowel, because the similarity rating is highest for the 3rd highest Danish vowel. So we get different results depending on whether we do perceptual similarity or ekphoric similarity. So which of these should we use? Which of these is a true measure of, well, similarity between 2 languages? Right? Which is more valid? And the jury is still out. We're currently conducting a study with a younger colleague where we're trying to find out for various predictions and the predictions that are made by both ekphoric and perceptual similarity for the discrimination or for the identification of second language vowels. And so far what we found is when ichthoric similarity is the same as perceptual similarity, the predictions are correct. You can rely on them. Okay, so that's good news. But sometimes ichthoric similarity and perceptual similarity do not yield the same results as we just saw, okay, for the Danish vowels and the English vowels. So both types of similarity generate correct in some cases and incorrect in other cases predictions. And that is actually quite frustrating. I'm sorry to say that, but it's frustrating for all of us, not just for us. Okay, so far we've seen that the perceptual basis of a foreign accent can be assessed through perceived L1 and L2 differences. And before turning to L1 independent causes of foreign accent, I find these very interesting, and maybe I can convince you that they are interesting. Here's another question. We sometimes tend to forget that speech perception does not just go through the ears, it also goes through the eyes. We perceive speech not just through the ears, but also through the eyes. And there are quite a few studies that have made use of this for perceptual training and looked at how second language learners make use of visual information. But we don't really know how this affects perceived dissimilarity. And here's just one example. I'm sorry I couldn't find a human face for this. But we all know, and you'll see the faces in a second, that the can be produced with tongue protrusion, that's American English, or without tongue protrusion, that's British English. Okay? Here's American English, here's British English. Okay? It's the same sound. It's the acoustic effect is absolutely identical, but you could imagine that in languages that do not use tongue protrusion, this sound is more different. It sticks more out. Okay? And the same could be the case for visually salient lip protrusion. Okay? If you want to learn to make an sh sound, which some Koreans aim to do occasionally, it may be useful to look at my lips. Sh. You need lip rounding for it. Sh is a lip rounded sound. R is a lip rounded sound. W is a lip rounded sound. It may support learning, and it may also support to hear the difference when you actually get visual information. So the final point of this lecture is that perception and production problems are not just shaped by the learner factors discussed earlier, not just caused by perceived differences between the sounds of the first and the second language, by native language biases, in other words. There is more and more evidence for universal perceptual preferences which non-native listeners and also infants bring to the task of language learning. These are L1 independent biases. I will talk about special universal status of specific acoustic properties which are non-functional in the L1 and dysfunctional for the perception of non-native speech sounds. And the example of this is duration for vowels. I briefly gave you an example at the beginning of the lecture, and I'd like to call this chronophilia because somehow we seem to like duration when we listen to speech sounds. And I will also talk about the special universal status of specific speech sounds which are preferred perceptual anchors, and they play also a role in second language speech learning. The example here are the natural reference vowels, and I could call this peripheral failure because it is a fondness for vowels that have a certain arrangement in the vowel space, as we will see. So chronophilia, the use of duration by native Spanish listeners, led to the formulation of the desensitization hypothesis. You saw this before, okay, where we said, where does this come from? Native Spanish speakers don't have duration in their native language. Why would they use duration to differentiate English E and E? So my desensitization hypothesis sounds like this. Whenever spectral differences are insufficient to differentiate vowel contrasts, because previous linguistic experience did not sensitize listeners to these spectral differences, like E and I for native Spanish speakers, duration differences will be used to differentiate the non-native vowel contrast, irrespective of whether the duration cue is phonologically relevant in the listener's L1 or not. Okay? And this has been tested and replicated in quite a few studies. Here's one that I'd like to show you from Kondorova and Francis, where they used the different native Spanish speakers, but also Russian speakers. And you can see that native English speakers use spectral differences to differentiate bit. Native speakers of Spanish and native speakers of Russian do not. Their responses are no different across the continuum. When we look at duration, what we found is a very slight effect of duration on native English speakers' responses, and for Russian and for Spanish, we see that there is a strong effect of duration. Why is this so? Because I and I do not exist in Russian. Russian doesn't have a duration contrast, and it seems to confirm the desensitization hypothesis, and has been tested and supported for many first languages with English as a second language: Mandarin, Portuguese, Spanish, Polish, and Catalan. It has also been supported for other second languages like Dutch, native speakers of Spanish, and German with native speakers of Turkish. So we can conclude that there is a default reliance on duration to differentiate non-native vowel contrasts. Non-native listeners like this more than the spectral contrast. It somehow makes it psychophysically easier to differentiate vowel contrasts that way. This is also the case of infant vowel perception. Infants also prefer, if they have the ability, if they are presented with duration contrasts, prefer to differentiate vowels by duration. So we have a default reliance on duration to differentiate to be learned vowel contrasts. I'm sorry, this is not something that will help Koreans because you already have duration in your native language, okay? But some other languages do not at all make use of this. So there are other acoustic properties of speech sounds which non-native listeners find particularly attractive, irrespective of whether they are functional or not. And here's just one example that still puzzles me. This is the never-ending Japanese RL story. Okay, it's cued by the third formant for native American English, native Danish, native German speakers, as you can see here. These are various tokens of initial consonants, and they differ in the second formant frequency and the third formant frequency. And what we do, I include myself, is we differentiate this according to third formant frequency. This is what native speakers of Japanese do. Just the opposite. They do this according to second formant frequency. Why would they do that? I have no idea why they do that, and it's totally dysfunctional. Nobody does this. So it's not the case that native Japanese speakers do not differentiate R and L. They use the wrong cue. That's the problem. Okay? So there may be more to this, but let's briefly look at universal preferences, other universal preferences that I've been have kept me quite busy over the past several years, so-called natural reference vowels. And I'd like to present you briefly the background. Many of you may not have conducted infant perception experiments. If you look at these hands, you will not believe it, more than 1,000 babies passed through these hands. And they all survived, okay? So in the type of experiment that I do, the head turn experiment, what typically happens is the infants are presented with tokens from a background category, something like doot, 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 and I could continue with that until you fall asleep, and then I suddenly say doot, and you wake up. Okay, that's basically it. They react to something different. And then they are rewarded by some dancing mechanical animals. Okay, so that's how we train them, and kids like that between the ages of roughly 4 months and 12 months. Can do this. Right, and it's important that we counterbalance foreground and background categories. So we in the discrimination of U and Ü, 50% of the infants hear a change from U to Ü, and 50% of the participants hear a change from Ü to U. Okay, has to be done. And this is how it looks like. Why do we do counterbalancing? It's typically done in experiments like these because discriminability can depend on the direction of presentation. Let me briefly quote from Ladd and Morton. Traditionally, order effects are treated as little more than a methodological nuisance that must be controlled for in designing experiments. On the basis of our discovery here, we feel that systematic investigation would be extremely valuable, and I can only agree, because when I talk to colleagues about this, when we found out about this, Linda Polk and I, about the asymmetries that we find very interesting, that I hope you will find interesting when I show them to you, most people said, yes, we counterbalance, but that's what we did. And we didn't really look at whether in one order or the other we would find differences. We're not interested in that. And I said, it's really interesting. And they said, yeah, you're right. We should have done so. But there are a few colleagues who helped us with their data. So what we found is this, that discriminability in experiments that I ran and that Linda also ran with Jenna Worker, that there's one direction that is easy to discriminate, from doot to doot, and another direction that is hard to discriminate. It's hard to discriminate from doot to doot, and it's easy from doot to doot. and that is not really logical. If you can tell A from B, you should be able to tell B from A. But that's not how language works. That's not how our minds work. Our minds work asymmetrically. And this was first observed but not really discussed a long time by Swoboda with infants, who found that the change from E to I is hard, but from I to E is easy. And then Linda Polka and Janet Worker, and later in the first study that I did with Linda Polka, we found that for all the vowels that we tested, one direction was hard and one direction was easy. And then we became more interested in this because there were hypotheses around that had something to do with the influence of the native language, and we didn't quite see how this could fit with our results. We looked at the literature, we conducted several additional studies, and I could give you a little task right now if we had the time, but we don't have the time. The arrow is the easier direction. And when you look at all of this, you could come up with something that looks like this. And please ignore this one. I'm still mad at the babies that they did this one. But otherwise, I really like babies, but I didn't like these babies. And just ignore this one. If you look at the arrows, what do the arrows tell you? They all go to the periphery. They all go to the periphery. And by the way, I don't have time for this. We also observe asymmetries in animal speech perception, in blackbirds, in cats, but they look very different. They are not according to the periphery of the vowel space. They are a function of formant change. Okay? They are not adjusted to the human vowel space. So what we have here is a robust and universal preference. It's independent of the native language or the language that the children are learning for vowels that are peripheral in the vowel space, no matter whether you call it the articulatory or the acoustic vowel space. And we call the vowels that are that act as anchors natural reference vowels. And please note that this is relative. E is attracted to E, but I is attracted to E. Okay? So a vowel in and of itself is not a natural reference vowel. It depends on which vowel it is paired with. Ö to O to O. Okay? When you compare these vowels. So this preference for natural reference vowels is maintained if only one vowel within a pair is functional in the native language, and it's lost if both vowels in a pair are functional in the native language. These are English infants and these are German infants. German infants hear both Ü and U, but both show a asymmetry, strong asymmetry, namely a prime score is a measure of discriminability. It's easier from Ü to U than from U to Ü, for English and for German learning children, independent of whether they hear these vowels or not. These are German adults and English adults. And we added noise to make it more difficult. The German adults don't show an asymmetry anymore. The English adults doesn't look like it, but it's significant asymmetry. They keep it because, well, they never hear Ü. Okay? And here we can see what Danish adults do. Danish infants do not have the contrast like in English, hot and hot. They show this asymmetry. I would also expect it for English learning children and Danish adults. If anything, they show a stronger asymmetry. They're never exposed to this. So the external asymmetry is maintained if there's no exposure, and it goes away because it would actually be dysfunctional if we have exposure to these contrasts. So one consequence of preference for the natural referent vowels would be the answer to the question, how good are native speakers of, say, English or Danish at discriminating a certain contrast? You would say it depends. And whenever you can say it depends in any kind of results, that's actually interesting because it shows that there's some kind of interaction going on. It's not a straightforward answer, right? So what we see here is that the difficulty does not really exist or is not so strong in one direction, hot to hot, but it is at 50% for Danish adults if it goes from hot to hot. Okay? So discrimination is a function of the direction. Okay. How about consonants? Very brief overview towards the end of my talk of evidence for natural referent consonants, which I've become interested in and some of my colleagues too. When you look at the literature, this is what we find across various languages. And if you look at this, you will see that overall, there is a special status of alveolars, as opposed to retroflex or dental consonants. A change from R to L is easier than the other way around. This is in Mandarin, Chinese, Malay, Taiwanese, Burmese. Wubui is an Australian Aboriginal language. And then we have Dutch and Japanese infants who who find it easier to hear a change from M to HNT, for example. So there's a special status of alveolar consonants, language independent. Okay? Let's look at manner of articulation. This is all I could find. V to B is easy, V to B is easy, F to P is easy. There is a special status of stops as opposed to fricatives. And this should delight anyone who speaks Korean, right? I don't think you're very fond of fricatives, are you? You just like one place of articulation and that's it for you, right? I know languages like German, f, v, s, z, sh, zh, h, h, and so on. Many, many more fricatives. So stops seem to have a special status over fricatives, according to this one. Okay? And then about voicing. Voicing is really somewhat, evidence is not really there yet, and it's ambiguous. Because what the study that we've conducted in Denmark seems to indicate that the change from a voiced to a voiceless is easier than the other way around, which was supported in other studies by Arabic infants. So here we may have a special status of native, the so-called familiar consonants. In all other cases, it's not necessarily the case that we have a special status of native consonants. We have a special status of a particular type, phonetic type of consonants. Okay. So, conclusion regarding evidence for natural referent consonants is that there is insufficient evidence to decide why consonants are referent consonants, because, well, they could be special, universal, articulatory acoustic characteristics, or there could be an effect of familiarity that referent consonants exist in the first language. In conclusion, the aim of the lecture was to present an overview of the factors that shape and cause foreign accented speech, and the most important learner factors which shape the degree of foreign accented speech is, well, I'm repeating myself, but it is so important, it's age of learning, okay? Age of first exposure to the L2. But note that age effects are due to attentional, they are not due to biological factors. And the evidence against the critical period hypothesis is strong, not just from phonetics. And then, of course, second language experience. And this is something that that teachers can do something about, because the more exposure you have to native-like foreign language, the better. Length of L2 use, type of L2 input, and language use patterns really make a difference, apart from age, which you can hardly manipulate unless you start learning a foreign language earlier. So what causes foreign accented speech? Language-specific perceptual biases. They can be revealed by the perceived relationship between the sounds of the first and the second language. This can be done in different ways, perceptual or phoric similarity, and the jury is still out on what is the better means to do this, but it needs to be done because all the other methods simply don't work. And universal perceptual biases may also cause foreign accented speech in perception or production. There are solid evidence for these universal perceptual biases for vowels, which has been well researched by now, with infants, with adults, with adolescents, and some evidence for these biases for consonants. And that's all. Thank you very much.